From the University of Tulsa and Public Radio Tulsa, this is Switchyard, a podcast for people hungry for eye-opening essays, moving fiction, soul-stirring poetry, and honest, thought-provoking conversation. I'm Ted Genoways, editor of Switchyard magazine, and your host. Join me and our lineup of literary all-stars as we think through and hash out our world's difficult and fascinating challenges. In January, just after the inauguration of Donald Trump, Switchyard organized a gathering of journalists from across the country to discuss how we would go about covering the new administration. We gathered together the biographers of Michelle Obama and Mitch McConnell, authors of books about the Koch brothers and the family, about Amazon and Google and Facebook, about the rise of white supremacy and the cash value of racism. We featured writers and editors for the New York Times, the LA Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and Mother Jones. For StoryCorps, This American Life, and Reveal. We also had musicians, filmmakers, novelists, essayists, and poets. As we had hoped, the gathering was a source of solace, a call to action and a chance to recommit ourselves to our values and best practices, and a rekindling of our belief in the power of storytelling in all its forms. In these unprecedented and difficult times, we are once again reporting on a president who characterizes journalists as enemies of the state and jokes about killing us. And he empowers and emboldens state and local officials to indulge their most authoritarian impulses. Here in the heart of Tulsa, on the grounds of the Tulsa Race Massacre and the end of the Trail of Tears, we have state officials who have sought to block the teaching of that history while requiring schools to buy Bibles branded with the new president's name. The solemn question each of our panels addressed: what are we going to do now? In this live episode about class, race, and poverty in America, we hear from Maya Frazier, Joe Clark, Tracy McMillan, and Monica Potts, with responses from Gary Lee and Paul Reyes. Maya Frazier is an award-winning investigative journalist based in Ohio. She's at work on a book about the history of the U.S. credit scoring system. Joe Clark is the author of a book, Lost at Sea, about the anchor-outs, an unhoused community living off the California coast in abandoned boats. Tracy McMillan is the author of The White Bonus, an attempt to calculate the cash value of racism in America. Monica Potts is the author of The Forgotten Girls, a memoir about growing up in rural Arkansas. Our two moderators are Gary Lee, the editor of the Oklahoma Eagle, and Paul Reyes, the editor of the Virginia Quarterly Review and author of the book Exiles in Eden: Life Among the Ruins of Florida's Great Recession.
Hi there, I'm Paul Reyes, editor of Virginia Quarterly Review. Welcome to the first panel for today, The Forgotten Man, Race, Class, and Poverty in America. I will let each of the panelists introduce themselves and open with their preamble, and then we can dive into the conversation.
Welcome to Tulsa, my hometown. I'm Gary Lee. I am executive editor of the Oklahoma Eagle and the Tulsa Local News Initiative. The Oklahoma Eagle is a weekly newspaper which traditionally has served the Black community of Tulsa. The Tulsa Local News Initiative is a newly founded nonprofit newsroom which will serve the city of Tulsa. Our offices of operation will actually be on the second floor of this building. I look forward to our panel and to engaging with you.
Hi, I'm Joe Clark. I'm an editor at Harper's Magazine, and today I'm going to talk about a book I recently spent 9 years working on by following an unhoused and housing insecure community in Northern California. So I'm just going to offer a brief observation in the hopes that it proves fruitful for the conversation. One challenge I've encountered when reporting on unhoused and otherwise vulnerable people is finding a way to make the audience connect with their struggles. In short, making them care. Here's an example. For about a decade, I followed an unhoused community in Northern California who slept on abandoned derelict boats floating in an estuary. Throughout much of their century-long existence, they maintained an uneasy truce with their rich neighbors on shore. But during the pandemic, all of that changed. The county and city where they reside spent well over $1 million to evict them, crushing their boats, forcing them into muddy encampments, and eventually, unfortunately, scattering them to the winds. As someone who's gotten to know personally those being evicted, their situation always seemed as clearly unjust and outrageous as it was grave. Residents of one of the richest counties in America were quietly driving from their borders these vulnerable, often elderly people who'd lived there in some cases for 50 years. At times, the callousness with which this was done was astounding. I'm reminded of one resident who explained at a city hall meeting that homelessness, while tragic, had no place in town because it was scaring off customers at the caviar shop. Early on, when I'd recount this saga to friends and strangers, as I have since done on many occasions, as I'm sure many people here can relate, I found that the plain sad facts alone often failed to elicit much in the way of empathy. Some common responses went like this: sure, it's sad, but why should the locals be forced to tolerate it? Or wouldn't everyone be happier if they just went to shelters? Or what's so wrong with asking them to go somewhere where they can get the help they need? On the one hand, it's a terrible question, and often I think when we cover these communities, we feel compelled not even to really address it because it seems so crass. But the fact that so many people are asking it is in itself interesting. And so I just want to keep that in mind for the next few minutes. So, over time as I'd tell this story, I noticed that the responses to the community's hardships became more impassioned and empathetic only when I took the time to recount the quotidian details of their lives. For instance, how they had invented their own holidays and weddings, their own traditions, or how they had founded their own church that broke into two sects over an ontological dispute a decade ago. Or how some members played Grand Theft Auto together on old laptops they'd hooked up to car batteries. Small things, sure, but somehow important to how the story was received. To it, listeners would now reply, how could anyone do this? This town should be ashamed of itself. Why doesn't someone stop this? And even occasionally the white whale, is there anything I can do? I think what's going on here is that these little moments are the ligature that holds together the life and community these people built. They provide a window into the century of history, feuds, jokes, and traditions that define their singular, peculiar place on Earth. And most importantly, they hint at all that will be gone forever, for everyone, from this place if you send away those who care for it. That is all just to say that these days, I remind myself when working on stories of people facing eviction, poverty, and different types of destruction, to take the time and try, as best I can, to understand and convey all they've built against all odds and all they stand to lose. Even the saddest circumstances contain those meaningful, happy moments of life, and the reader needs to understand them to know what people are fighting for. To this end, I have a closing story. Once, maybe 5 years ago, I was talking to a woman who had slept for a while in a boat on the water. She told me how she was harassed by some of the men in their community. Unfortunately, not an uncommon experience for women on the water. She wished she could ask the town for help. Why can't she? I questioned her. Because, she said, they will use it as justification to destroy the community, to crush everyone's boats. They just didn't get it. They didn't get what this anchorage was. What was it? I asked. Look, she explained. If someone calls the police because a man breaks into their home and hurts them, the police come and arrest the man. They don't bulldoze the neighborhood. The anchorage, she said, was her neighborhood. It had problems like any other, but she loved her neighborhood, and she wanted others to love it too.
I'm Monica Potts, and I'm a journalist at 538 now, and our joke is that I cover the what people think beat, and I try to talk to voters and look at surveys to see what actual voters think, which is, I think, somewhat unusual in political journalism. I just wrote a book a couple years ago, The Forgotten Girls, and it was a memoir of my hometown of Clinton, Arkansas. So I'm from this small town on the southern edge of the Ozarks in north central Arkansas, and it's about 2,500 people. It never gets any bigger. And I think about it all the time. I write about it often. It's sort of the muse and inspiration, I think, for my career. As soon as I reached a place in my career where I could kind of decide what kind of journalism I wanted to do and what I wanted to cover, I started to focus on writing about families in little places like my hometown, in the middle of the country, far from city centers, and full of low income and working class people. Many rural counties in this country are also overwhelmingly white, although not all of them. Very many writers call the group of people that I grew up among the white working class. I have some quibbles with that, but I'll save that for another day. When Trump won in 2016, that mission took on a different sense of urgency. And in part, it was because there was suddenly a lot of reporting about rural America and the white working class. But I felt much of it was superficial and lacked nuance. I think readers also tired of it quickly. Someone on social media derisively called them Cletus safaris, and I think that's kind of stuck in my mind as what they were. I think people felt like they'd heard enough about these kinds of stories and called for them to stop, but I kept returning to them, and I kept returning to my hometown mentally and imaginatively, and then ultimately physically. I moved back in 2018, and I lived there until a little over a year ago. While Trump did improve his margins in cities in 2024, places like my hometown are still by and large Trump country. They're rural, home to large populations without college degrees. They're also relatively low income. The median household income in my home county is $47,000 a year, and it's always at about that range compared to the national median income. It's always about half the median income. But when you talk about these kinds of broad statistics, it leaves out a lot of variation. Small towns still have internal class stratification and divisions and hierarchies. For most of the time I lived in Clinton, a large landowner and local business owner flew a Trump flag along with the American flag from a pole in a large field along the highway just in front of his store. He's not just a local business owner, he's the son of the family that once owned the only furniture store in town, so he's sort of a local royalty in some ways. I don't know his yearly income or net wealth, but every year he hosts a local rodeo-like event that shuts the town down, and the whole town revolves around it, even local services. And so I think most people think of him as the richest man in town, and I'd be shocked if he wasn't among the richest people in town. I saw that a lot. I would drive up mountains where the bigger houses were, and I would see these huge houses with barns on huge acres of cleared land that people raised cattle on as a side hustle, in addition to their other incomes. And they were always flying these huge Trump flags. And so I think we think of, the Trump voters as the people who live in trailers and lower income people in rural parts of the country, but they're also these people. I want to also kind of put that in perspective. While people in places like my home county generally make less money and the cost of living is lower, that doesn't mean everyone is poor or thinks of themselves as poor. A family making about $200,000 a year, which might be middle class on the coasts, is doing really well in a place like my home county. The sociologist Arlie Hochschild noticed this in her most recent book, Stolen Pride, and she found what she called the local elites were the biggest Trump fans and the most likely to vote for Trump. So they're often the people who might not have gone to college, but they own car dealerships and businesses and work in construction and have managed to do better financially than many of their neighbors. Even a family making $80,000 to $90,000 a year is doing fairly well in a place like that. And I bring this up because I think it's important to remember this in the context of Trump's 2024 win. In survey after survey, voters named the economy as one of their top issues, along with immigration. But what exactly were their economic objections? A lot of national reporting is influenced by expectations with people that college degrees who live on the coasts have for status and well-being and a middle-class life. But if you live in that context, you might look at a family making a salary of $80,000, $90,000 a year and see people who are struggling, but that may not be how they see themselves. And it may not even be how they think of economic class in that way. So when I talk to voters and interview people from that part of the world, they want to pay less for goods. They blame Biden and government spending for inflation and increased costs of living. They are often middle-class people who don't want to pay more for services. And sometimes they're local elites rebelling against efforts by the Biden administration to give more cash assistance to low-income families. A lot of them objected to the enhanced unemployment benefits. They objected to increased minimum wages. Arkansas increased its minimum wage in 2021. It's an economic story and it's an economic grievance, but we would approach it in a different way than we would a low-income family that's struggling to pay their rent or to make ends meet. And in fact, the EPI, whatever that stands for, I forgot right now, they have found that wages grew fastest on the bottom in the post-COVID recovery, that people with lower incomes actually saw their wages increase the most in the recovery. And I interviewed people who left fast food service jobs and used their enhanced unemployed benefits and the stimulus money to go get a job and be a paramedic and something. So, I think my goal has always been to keep these kinds of multi-layered stories in mind. I knew local business owners in my small hometown that didn't make that much money, but also objected to paying their workers more, paying more for services. They see themselves as taxpayers whose money is being taken from them, and they want to keep their money. They don't see themselves as the beneficiary of government services, even though they often are. And so even though I write about low-income places, the lowest income families in those places aren't the only ones there. And they're also not the ones who vote in the highest numbers. They're not the local decision makers and leaders. I think that's important to keep in mind as we head into the second term.
I'm Tracy McMillan. I write books and freelance journalism, and I'm sort of coming back into reporting freelance after publishing a book this spring called The White Bonus: 5 Families and the Cash Value of Racism in America. So that profiles folks around the country in Texas, Mississippi, Pennsylvania, New York City, California, including me and my family. And what I'm about to read is sort of me playing with language to try and make the reporting I did in that book easier to digest. I have found that at least in 2024, a project called The White Bonus was not received with a lot of excitement by a lot of folks and has made it harder in some ways to have a productive conversation, right? I was taught to believe in the American dream. For a Gen X white girl and a white flight exurb in the Rust Belt, that meant I grew up believing that I could do anything. I was taught to believe that the founders meant what they said, that we are all equal. I was taught to believe that to be a good American was to be colorblind. I was taught to believe that if I worked hard enough to prove my merit, I would get what I deserved. That was my American dream. On Monday, our president promised to make that American dream come true. He promised to, quote, forge, and I think that verb is useful here, forge a country that is colorblind and merit-based. That's a lovely idea, being colorblind and merit-based, but this country has never been either. I can tell you that as someone who has reported on class here for a quarter century, and I can also tell you that as someone who has lived here nearly twice as long. When I was 42, I reported on Maximus, a corporation that found it could profit from the paperwork of public benefits. The more paper there is, the more money Maximus makes. I met Sue, a white illiterate gas station attendant in Indiana who had high blood pressure, and she kept losing her public health insurance, which Maximus helped administer. Every time she missed an appointment or failed to send in the $1 a month the state began to require in order to promote, quote, personal responsibility, she lost her insurance. She got sicker. She also faced more paperwork, which made Maximus more money. Sue's merit, what she deserved, healthcare, did not seem to matter. That was in 2017. But the myth of merit goes further back than that. When I was 33, I worked undercover at a Walmart outside Detroit where I had a black male coworker in his 20s. His name was Brian. He had worked in produce markets for years and knew the ripening schedule of every piece of produce by heart. He had applied for the manager position, but Walmart hired Randy instead. Randy was 22 years old and white, and he did not know that plantains were related to bananas. So far as I could tell, he showed no signs of aptitude for his job. Brian's merit, what he deserved, did not seem to matter. This was in 2010, but the myth of merit goes back farther than that. When I was 21 and paying part of my way through NYU, a financial aid clerk gave me bad information. I ended up with a bill for $750 that I could not pay. I put on a thrifted blouse and went to an office. I asked a man in a suit, the financial aid dean, to cover the balance. I thought I deserved an education I could afford. I was at NYU because financial aid made it cheaper for me to go there than in-state at the University of Michigan, where I'd also been admitted. I didn't know then, as I do now, that U of M had become unaffordable in part because in the Michigan legislature, they bled state funding for public higher education over the last 4 decades, or previous, right, not last from now. I didn't know that the funding was cut over and over because white voters stopped supporting taxation for public services. I didn't know that the cuts, even in my northern home state, began as soon as the Supreme Court declared school segregation unconstitutional in 1954. And that dean's office in New York, I made my case in my thrifted blouse. The man in the suit sighed vacantly and said there was nothing he could do. Then he realized I'd been nominated to Phi Beta Kappa, an honor society of which I had never heard. He was the local chapter's treasurer. His whole demeanor changed, and he told me he'd wipe the slate clean. After all, he said with a wink, I was Phi Bay. My merit did not seem to matter. That was in the 1990s. But it goes back further than that. When I was 8, my mom was hit by a drunk driver while driving home on a curvy rural road in February. She ended up with a brain injury. The insurers didn't want to pay. They said she did not deserve care because she already had a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. We ended up in a lawsuit. As the lawsuit dragged on, she had no consistent care. My grandma called it, quote, a real mess. 9 years later, on April 4th, 1993, Michigan Supreme Court ruled she deserved coverage. It didn't matter by then. She had died 5 weeks earlier, on February 24th. My mom's merit, which is to say what she deserved, did not seem to matter, at least not when it counted. That was in the 1980s. As a journalist, I have many tasks ahead: to document, to see the bigger picture, to fight, to try to help even when the chances of success are small. But in order to be of use, now but certainly for future generations, I also have to push against the myth on which my American dream was based. I have to remember that the game is not to prove who deserves what. It is to do work that reminds us and those in power that we all deserve to have enough.
I'm Maya Frazier. I'm a journalist who's been based in Ohio her whole career. I live in Columbus, Ohio, and I freelance for magazines. I also work with the Watchdog Writers Group at the University of Mizzou. Right now, I've been spending the past few years working very specifically on trying to understand the credit score system and its relationship to debt and income inequality in the U.S. I'm at work on a book for Knopf called Scored that looks very deeply at those issues. I've been spending the past few years trying to understand how this largely unexamined system has contributed to what's been a stunning rise in geographic and income inequality in the U.S., which has risen fourfold since 1980. I've been investigating what is a diffuse, punitive, and ubiquitous system, yet one that infuses all aspects of daily life, especially among low-income Americans. Most critically, I've examined this system's history and its antecedents, and I've tried to understand how it has gained so much legitimacy. Because we're at a moment where we've largely accepted that this is just the way things are. But what's interesting is that the credit score, separate from the system, you might say, but is relatively new, truly only burst into the public consciousness in the early 2000s. And just to back up, this is how things are if one looks at just this single metric. By some estimates, there are 42 million people living under the stigma of bad credit in the U.S. They are more likely to be poor. They are more likely to live in majority-minority communities. Those with high scores, as you might expect, are more likely to be wealthy and live in majority-white communities. As such, my basic premise is that credit scores closely approximate America's racial and class divides. How the credit score shapes our communities influences who gets ahead and who gets left behind, and more specifically, the uneven distribution of bad credit in low-income and minority communities, where the level of financial deprivation is shockingly high, is sort of the subject of my inquiry. Which brings me back to the question at hand for today. How do we think about this in relationship to our coverage? And the one thing that I keep going back is we know that based on exit polling, that inflation was a decisive issue in the election. 73% of Trump voters said it had caused them severe hardship. What I have found in my reporting in recent years is that there's another form of sort of constant grinding, cruddy, inescapable, and punitive inflation that influences daily life for low-income Americans. And a lot of folks don't realize the relationship between the rise of the credit scoring system and sort of this idea of risk-based pricing and the way that has sort of infused how the economy works for people, especially at the low end of the income ladder. This is really... I've never spoken with my glasses on. You guys are all blurry. It's kind of great. So I can't see anybody's reactions. Anyway, there's a really key idea that I think's worth relating to this question about how people voted in the last election. It's the idea that The idea that the poor ought to qualify for more favorable terms because they were poor, that was an idea that had some credence about 4 decades ago, before we saw this massive rise in income inequality in this country. And we've basically replaced that idea that the terms of credit should be based on one's credit score. That's the economic world we're living in. The notion that inflation is this sort of thing that affects everybody in the same way, I think is wrong, because folks in low income levels just live in a state of constant runaway inflation. And that's what I found in my reporting. So I'm going to shift to actually what I was truly going to talk about today, but I had to sort of scale back because I didn't realize we were doing a podcast, and some of the reporting I didn't want kind of out yet because of sources. But at his inaugural address, Trump vowed to end the government policy of trying to socially engineer race and gender into every aspect of public and private life. We will forge a society that is colorblind and merit-based. I've spent a lot of time, obviously, immersing myself into sort of like the language and culture of these companies that thrive within this system. And colorblind is just, that's the word that's used at all times by this industry. That is how this system gains its legitimacy and had gained its legitimacy. But I wanted to make a note here is that what's important now is this sort of freeing of the banking industry that's happening with Trump's arrival. And there was an interesting comment by a banker to the Financial Times, who he noted that I feel liberated. A top banker bragged, we can say retard and pussy without the fear of getting canceled. It's a new dawn. Which brings me to another line of inquiry that I'm pursuing in my reporting, which has a Tulsa connection here. You may not have noticed, but the DOJ since 21 has been undergoing a very aggressive strategy it's called the Combating Redlining Initiative. And that initiative is now going to be quashed under a Trump administration. But the relationship between redlining and sort of our redlining present that we have today and the credit scoring system is very tightly wound. Difficult to unpack in a short time frame, but I want to talk to you a little bit about what were some of the findings of that initiative. That brings us to Tulsa. More specifically, a story about redlining here is that over a 7-year period, there was a single bank. It's called the American Bank of Oklahoma, and they made only one mortgage loan out of 1,527 to a non-white family. They also opened up all their branches in majority white communities around Tulsa and didn't open a single bank in a majority Black community. Tulsa isn't an outlier. In Houston, a bank located all 13 of its branches in white neighborhoods. In Philadelphia, a mortgage company with 53 offices opened only 2 in Black neighborhoods. In Los Angeles County, a bank operated only 3 branches in Black neighborhoods. Its other 34 branches were all in white neighborhoods. And for some context, the Black population of Los Angeles County exceeds 50%. In Memphis, where more than half of the census tracts are majority Black and Hispanic, a bank opened only 4 branches in these communities. Its other 21 branches were in white neighborhoods. There are other cases equally egregious, major settlements with the feds for redlining, with equally terrible examples in Camden, Wilmington, Newark, Columbus, Rhode Island, and Jacksonville. The reason why I quoted that banker in the Financial Times is because the case in Tulsa involved the feds were able to pursue a consent decree with this bank because of some internal emails amongst the banking staff that I will not repeat here because they're horrible, but they were what you might expect, using really bad words, let's just put it that way, about Black community in Tulsa. The point I'm trying to make here is that in all likelihood, the Department of Justice and our Trump administration is going to quash this initiative. Now, I would like to back up and say that this redlining initiative, it has its own flaws. Banking policy in the U.S. is incredibly complicated, and the regulatory system around it is incredibly complex. And even if you read through the consent decrees, the way the proposals to address some of these inequities are pretty minimal and disappointing from that standpoint. The dysfunction and failures of a half-century of federal policies to stop redlining and a decades-long strategy by the banking lobby to stall racial progress, we're going to see this continue under the Trump administration. These investigations will end.
Thank you, Joe, Monica, Tracy, and Maya. Each of you presented narratives which, from my perspective as a journalist, raise questions and will lead to other narratives, I'm sure. Maya's story about banking and Tulsa and inflation inspired my first question to all of you. In the run-up to the 2024 election, Donald Trump made lots of threats and promises to take actions which would directly affect economically challenged poor people, people of color. And many of those threats were dismissed as bluster, as campaign rhetoric. People who dismissed those threats were wrong. So we already know action will be taken and that these actions will have detrimental effects on people who are economically challenged, people of color. My question is this: of the policy initiatives which have been mentioned, discussed, which of those do you think that we as journalists should be most worried about, should go directly to research and write about?
One thing I'm certainly paying attention to are work requirements for public benefits. So these were rules introduced during the Clinton administration for welfare reform, and that sort of paved the way for the retrenchment of welfare policy. So during the initial Trump administration, I mean, the reason I wrote about Maximus is that an advocate, I think actually at EPI or CBPP, had tipped me off to listening to an investor's call with Maximus after the 2016 election. And they were very clear. They were like, this is great for us. They're going to put work requirements on Medicaid. That is a great way for us to make money. You know, it's not just that we have these punitive rules to sort of get rid of social provision, but this idea that you have to prove constantly that you deserve the help, right? Both creates a profit center and serves to retrench. And a lot of the work that I do, right, is sort of about how racialized messaging is used to justify that, and then it ends up hurting everybody. I think work requirements are a big thing.
Thank you. Monica?
I agree with that. And I think part and parcel with that, one of the first things they'll look to cut is Medicaid expansion from the ACA. And they'll cut it, I think, partially through work requirements, which Arkansas had already instituted. That program was rolled back in the courts. A lot of Medicaid recipients are either already working or are on disability and are exempt from those. But the system was terrible. The website was complicated. People couldn't participate. And so people lost their benefits just because of this regulatory hurdle. And Arkansas knew that. Arkansas has been working with Maximus for a really long time to, what they would say is, enroll people in workforce training, but it's really to connect them to a system in which they could eventually kick them off of benefits because they aren't working or because they're not meeting the requirements or able to report that they're meeting the requirements even. So, but I do think a lot of aspects of the ACA that people actually like now and have gotten used to, they're going to try to start to roll back. And the biggest one is Medicaid funding. And I think there are 9 states that already have trigger laws that would roll back Medicaid expansions if the funding from the federal government ends.
Maya, anything to add?
There's a lot going on with HUD with reforming the appraisal industry. That's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. I've been following that storyline, and there's been a big push to automate the appraisal process. That has its pros and cons as far as like speeding up the acquisition of properties within certain areas by the investor class. But it's also one of those things where the challenge is purging the language in the way this is done and processed and the way people talk about race. Just like the sort of bank regulation, this is sort of this really hidden, yet where the really meat of these questions about how we talk about race, not just in the cultural context, but like really where it's really important, like who gets capital and who doesn't, who gets access to housing and who doesn't. That's probably going to get completely rolled back. I mean, I have my own questions about it because it's a very neoliberal solution to a problem that a lot of times around banking and financial policy, the thing that you think is going to do good actually makes the problem worse, is what I've found in my research. And so that whole appraisal thing is, I think, a very undercovered story, very important to sort of think about how a Trump administration versus a Biden administration thinks about race and economic uplift.
Excellent. Joe, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I would just say that I think, to me, in general, the idea that they're going to shrink so much the federal government and the size of the permanent civil service workforce is broadly kind of scary for these communities for two reasons. Number one, I think one thing that surprised me as I spent so much time over the years with this particular group of people is any gain they got, it was a process gain. Right. It was a slow churn of process through either local, then state, then federal agencies. You would have people who would spend like a month in the public library and they would just find a strange, crazy path to try to fight for something that they needed. And most of the time it didn't work out for various reasons. But when there was a gain, that's what it was. I don't know exactly what the implications will be, but when you shrink this bureaucracy, for lack of a better term, I think you're going to have people with less avenues for redress. But then I think in some ways more concerning, but it would be harder for me to exactly connect the dots, is I think that when things happen like that on a federal level, what I notice a lot is that this particular town, Sausalito, they take a lot of their cues from what's happening at the state and then federal level, right? And so I should say, this town, I believe over 90% identifying as registered Democrats. They understand on some level that it looks bad what they're doing. But if they're doing it where they're like, look, this is the world, this is part of the system, this is the way it's built, we're just abiding by these rules. Like there is a lot of space between local law, state law, and federal law. And so there is a lot of interpreting that happens. And that interpreting doesn't happen without self-interest. And so when you shrink these sort of established pathways and processes, you're leaving it open for those to shrink at the state and local level as well. Also because of funding. That's another thing. A lot of the way information is gathered on these communities is through various counts, through volunteers that get federal money. When there's going to be less of that money, there's less people doing that work. And so I think that just the idea downstream that there will be less money, less systems, less processes, broadly speaking, that seems to me like it cannot be good for the most vulnerable people.
Thank you. I want to turn the floor to Paul.
Actually, I'd like to follow up with Joe, if that's possible, and talk about, because last night we talked about the statistic from your book about 650,000 unhoused people in the United States, and you mentioned the fungibility of data depending on its ends. And you just mentioned interpreting. Now, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how data is how it's manipulated in order to achieve.
Well, so in the case of this community known as the anchor outs, on a very local level, for instance, despite the fact that for like a century, this has been an issue in the town that's been hotly debated, there has never really been a comprehensive government survey. Occasionally, someone who lives in that community will try to do one. One of the reasons, I think, for this is that in some counts, under some definitions of homelessness as like a state definition, this group would not be counted. And this is one of the things the activists bring up, is that it's rather unique that the county counts them as homeless. But they do that, I'll just say that the people fighting for them would say, is they do that because it allows them to get federal and state money. But then at the same time, when they try to argue like, okay, now we have this community and we need money to try to house them. But now for, I believe it was over a year at one point after they had evicted them and they were living in tents on shore, not a single person had been housed. And all of this money went to case managers and went to all these people, right? So there becomes this whole incentive to count them here. Whereas, say, if you're the state of California, you don't have that same incentive to have your unhoused population increasing. So you might not be counting them. Because a lot of those counts, depending on who's doing the counting, right, a lot of them rely on these point-in-time surveys, and they're done, say, every other year. But the people working for them, they're working for an organization that itself, which is not necessarily in any case negative, but for itself has its own interests in the numbers coming out a certain way. Because the definition itself of what it means to be unhoused is so fluid, it does leave a lot open to interpretation. And the last thing I'll say, just because I think it's the most telling example of this, is so in this particular scenario, this community of people, the anchor out,